Have you ever experienced something so mind-blowing, you had to blink twice to make sure it was real? In today's video, we're diving into the wildest real-life experiences that people have witnessed with their own eyes. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more crazy tales, and share your own unbelievable moments in the comments. We just might feature your story in a future video. When I was 14, I was at Arby's with my mom in Kentucky. We were eating inside and looking out the window. All at once, a jet black SUV and a jet black Cadillac pull into the parking lot. Nobody gets out of either of these two cars. About 5 minutes later, 3 flashy sports cars pull up. I didn't know what they were at the time, but they looked like new Ferraris or Lamborghinis, each a different model. The instant the sports cars pulled up, about 10 huge Italian guys in expensive-looking suits got out of the black car and SUV. Meanwhile, 6 or 7 South American-looking guys in suits stepped out of the sports cars. One of the Italian guys started talking to one of the South American guys. They shook hands, and then the Italian guy returned to his car and grabbed a small toiletries bag about the size of a football, handing it to the South American guy. The South American guy disappeared into his car, and after a minute, he rolled down his window and called over 2 of his buddies. They opened the trunk, which was in the hood of the car, and lifted out a large, heavy duffel bag, placing it into the SUV's trunk before getting back in their cars. The sports cars and the SUV drove off, and after they left, 4 guys from the Cadillac strolled into Arby's to order food. My mom looked really freaked out and whispered to me not to look at them. So, we just sat there in silence until they finished ordering and left. When we got back to our car, my mom called my dad, telling him what happened and asking if she should call the police. My dad must have told her not to, because she didn't. To this day, I'm convinced I saw some strange, suspicious exchange go down in a Kentucky parking lot at 11 a.m. Weird. I turned 21 on vacation, so I'd already gotten the excitement out of my system. When I got back home, a buddy and I went out for my first legal visit to a local nightclub. There was a Queen tribute band playing that night, and their big song, of course, was Bohemian Rhapsody. We were pretty close to the stage, within 10 feet or so, when a huge flash pot explosion went off right at the big climax. Unfortunately, someone made a serious mistake in loading the effects, and one of them went off like a mini claymore, sending shrapnel into the crowd. We were just far enough back to avoid injury, but the people right in front of us weren't as lucky. There were a few with bleeding wounds, and one guy on the ground with serious leg injuries. I hadn't had much to drink, but my buddy was pretty crushed, and in his own way observed of the injured man, "That guy's legs are gone." Which was only partly true. Luckily, there were already police on site for security, so the emergency response was quick. I grabbed my buddy, got us out of the way, and headed home. When I got back, my dad was watching CNN, and they had a brief update on the explosion, though it didn't make much news. This was the early 90s, when every explosion wasn't immediately big news. Later, I heard that the guy who took the brunt of the explosion had been a dancer before the incident. Getting injured like that would be terrible no matter what, but it seemed especially cruel for a dancer. I was pretty naive back then, though, and I've seen fate throw even stranger twists since. One sunny Sunday afternoon, I was driving my Cadillac along one of the quieter streets in Toronto. I was in the right lane, sticking mostly to the 50-zone speed limit, and chatting on my cell phone, still legal back then. I noticed an SUV behind me that seemed to be in a real hurry. The driver kept tailgating, even though he could have easily passed in the left lane. As he continued tailgating, I just kept going at my own pace, unbothered. Eventually, the SUV moved to the left lane to pass. As he pulled alongside me, the driver rolled down his window. I could see a woman in the passenger seat, and the man started shouting and swearing at me like a complete maniac. I glanced over, made a shh gesture, and pointed to the phone I was holding to my ear, trying to brush him off. That gesture seemed to set him off even more. The next thing I knew, I saw what looked like an extra-large orange soft drink flying out of the SUV window, splashing across the left side of my windshield. I thought, what just happened? I can't let this guy get away with that. So I caught up to the SUV, and once again we were driving parallel. As I rolled my window down, I could hear both the driver and the woman in the passenger seat laughing and pointing at me. Holding the steering wheel with my left hand, I grabbed a large bottle of Pepsi with my right. I calmly untwisted the cap, and with one quick move, threw the entire bottle through my window and into their SUV, right onto the woman's lap. It landed perfectly, and the carbonated drink burst all over her and the SUV's interior. She started screaming, and I could see the shocked expressions on both their faces. I smiled, rolled my window up, wiped my windshield, and continued driving. I think they may have stopped laughing at that point. I'm not sure if I witnessed this or experienced it, but it's definitely a memorable story. I was in South Africa working on animal conservation, and on weekends, we'd explore different parts of the country. One time, we visited a place called Lion Park, where you drive through fields with lions, zebras, and other animals all around you. We passed into the section with the lions right as they were being fed. There were multiple signs instructing visitors to roll up their windows, but in my eagerness to capture the perfect photo without glare, I rolled mine down. Lions have a strong social order, and usually, the male lions eat first, followed by the females. This time, though, one bold female decided to start eating before the male, and he didn't like it. He charged at her, and since my car was directly behind her, he ended up scratching the outside of the passenger door where I was sitting. There were just a few inches of metal between me and the lion's claws, and I could even feel its mane brush against me. Later that same day, right after we left, there was a report of a serious incident at the park. The news described the exact time and a description of the van involved, and we realized we'd seen that same van entering the park just as we were leaving. About 8 years ago, while camping in Idaho, I saw a triangle-shaped UFO. It was around 3 a.m., and I was still up playing guitar by the campfire with a couple of friends. I was leaning back in a Lafuma chair when I spotted 3 lights in the shape of a triangle moving directly overhead. If you held a bottle cap at arm's length, that's about how big it looked in the sky. The lights moved slowly, almost rotating as they glided along. I pointed it out to my friends, and they saw it too. We all watched for about 30 seconds as it passed silently overhead, eventually disappearing over a mountain. There was no sound at all. It was honestly the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed, other than seeing my kids be born. Later, I learned that a lot of people have reported seeing similar black triangle UFOs. Just Google black triangles. I still have no idea what it was, and for some reason, that mystery makes me insanely happy. When I was 12, my mom, sister, and I were on our way back from the beach in Florida. A car suddenly sped around us on a no-pass road, then continued doing the same to others. Moments later, there was a major accident right in front of us. We swerved into a gas station to avoid it. It turned out the driver who had been speeding tried to pass with an oncoming car approaching, dodged the accident, and kept driving. An S10 pickup truck with 2 elderly passengers collided head-on with another car. The car's driver was a woman who had been following her husband and kids to the beach. I ran up to the pickup. The man driving it had the steering wheel was so far into his stomach it looked horrible. He had not survived, and his wife beside him was injured and screaming. A few of us hurried over to the other car, where the woman's husband was calling out for her to wake up. We tried to open the doors, but they were stuck. Sadly, she didn't make it either. I'm not sure what happened to the elderly woman, but I do know that someone in a hurry that day took the lives of a young mother, wife, husband, and possibly a grandfather. It all happened so fast. Afterward, when we got back into the car, I forgot to buckle up. I had never heard my mom curse before, but she turned to me and said, "Did you not just see what happened?" Even through everything else that has happened over the years, I haven't heard her say it since. I'm a bit sheltered, but here goes. 3 years ago, my friends and I were at Snowqualmie Pass Alpental ski resort. We got kicked off the mountain around noon due to a huge snowstorm, the biggest storm of the year, actually. We walked to the parking lot in front of the lodge, crossed a small footbridge, and reached our car. Just as we were getting ready to take off our gear, a man in his 40s waved to us, using the hand signal for a phone call. He spoke little English, so he called a family member who explained they were lost and asked us to give them a ride to Seattle. We politely declined but offered to help with their van, which was stuck in the snow. Inside were his wife and 3 kids, all under 10. The parking lot had about 20 cars, and ours was parked farthest out since we didn't need to leave the mountain. We had a house up there. My friends and I, along with 2 other guys, managed to help push their van free with the whole family inside. Just then, one of the other guys looked up and shouted, "Hey, is that an avalanche?" We all glanced up at the hill at the back of the parking lot, where snow was barreling down toward us. In a split second, everyone outside the cars started running. My friends and I, all former track runners, took off fast despite being in ski and snowboard boots, making it to the front of the lot and ducking behind some cars just as the avalanche came down. We rushed back to the van, which was partially buried under the snow, and worked together to dig them out. The family was talking rapidly in Spanish, trying to make sense of what had happened. Eventually, we all got to the lodge, where the staff called for backup. My friend's Escalade, where we would have been standing to change our gear, was now partially buried under debris, with a log weighing at least 200 pounds indented into the back bumper. It was the first avalanche of that size in 35 years. Sheesh, I have a stack of these, not sure where to begin really. One of my earliest memories of total chaos happened during a soccer game on Long Island, where my league was based. I was under 10, and this particular tournament took place at fields that shared space with a horse ranch of some sort. In the middle of a game, we suddenly heard parents yelling, "Get off the field," and saw the referee sprinting to the sideline. We quickly ran to the edges just as a dozen horses came stampeding across the field at full speed. Apparently, this was routine for the horses, who would leave their stalls and bolt across to a large open field where they'd spend the day, completely unfazed by the people in the way. Not long after that, I had another close encounter with a horse. I went to give it an apple, but the horse decided it had other plans. It kicked the stall door clean off the hinges and seemed to think I was somehow responsible for keeping it there, because it started coming toward me fast. Being all of 8 years old, I dropped the apple and ran out screaming. I haven't really trusted horses since. One of the craziest things I've ever witnessed happened back when my friends and I were in middle school. We were out longboarding down some hills in a rougher area near my house. We didn't think much of it and were even filming our ride until our camera battery died. As we were passing through some apartment complexes, a group of 4 guys on motorcycles pulled up behind us and started revving their engines, like they were trying to intimidate us. We picked up our pace a little, but then one of the guys popped a wheelie and started coming toward us fast. We all scattered to get out of the way, but the biker lost control and started wobbling. My friend wasn't able to move in time and ended up getting hit. He flipped in the air and landed on a guardrail. The biker crashed into a pole, wrecking his bike, but it was my friend who really got hurt. His leg was badly broken, with the bone visibly out of place. At first, he was in shock and didn't feel the pain, even tried to stand up, but when it hit him, he started screaming. He ended up spending 6 months on the couch with a metal frame around his leg while it healed. That whole incident is definitely one of the wildest things I've ever witnessed in real life. I'm from Vancouver, and every summer, we have the Celebration of Lights Festival, basically a big fireworks display that draws huge crowds, including a lot of teens partying. This event brings out over 200,000 people, and you can imagine the chaos on the streets as everyone tries to get home afterward. We were walking home after the show, and the crowd was moving slowly because it was so packed. Suddenly, we noticed a car trying to make its way through the mass of people. It was a convertible, barely inching forward in the dense crowd. Out of nowhere, a group of 5 people jumped into the car and began threatening the passengers. The 2 people in the car had no way to defend themselves, and the crowd was either too packed to help or too frightened to intervene. The group took the passengers' bags and belongings before disappearing into the crowd. There were no police around at that moment, but nurses, lifeguards, and doctors in the crowd stepped in to help the injured passengers. To this day, it remains one of the most intense and frightening things I've ever seen in person. When you see a lot of unusual things, they can start to blur together. But the most memorable experience for me was the first time I saw a deceased person. I was with my dad at the fire hall for career day, and they let me observe on a few low priority calls. A call came in about a backyard fire, so we went just to let the homeowner know they needed to put it out. We pulled up and got no answer at the door, so with the police, we went around to the backyard. There, lying half into a smoldering fire, was an older man. From his shoulder up, he had been badly affected by the flames. It appeared he'd been there for a while. We later found out he'd been burning some leaves when he likely had a heart attack and fell in. It was my first time seeing something like that in real life. Surprisingly, I found it more interesting than disturbing. Another unbelievable experience happened when I was driving down a 4-lane road with side streets around 3 a.m. Suddenly, a car ran a stop sign with no lights on, and I barely missed it. Naturally, I slammed on my brakes. Then, out of nowhere, another car struck my left side. It was a police officer who had been in pursuit but also didn't have his lights or headlights on. I called 911 and got out to help the officer, whose legs were clearly injured, and he was more focused on getting out to take a statement from me about why I hit him. In the end, all charges were dropped, and I received a $500 gift certificate from the station for stabilizing him until the ambulance arrived. The best part was having to tell him firmly to stay still. I was in the backseat of my friend's car on the way to a friend's band's first show. We were driving on the highway, heading downhill on a big dip. In the distance, on the opposite side of the road, I saw a white Jeep on the upswing. Suddenly, it was airborne, crossing over the wide, grassy median into our lane. It was spinning wildly midair, with debris flying off in every direction. I pointed past my friends in the front and shouted, Holy crap. We were a ways behind, but since we were going downhill and it was uphill on the other side, I had a clear line of sight. Traffic slowed to a crawl as we got closer to the scene. When we passed, we noticed someone putting a jacket over a figure leaning partly out of the window, as the Jeep had landed on its side. We didn't make the full connection until later when we heard about it on the radio. Apparently, the woman driving had been in a minor fender bender earlier in the day and reportedly appeared drowsy. It seemed she might have dozed off on the highway, leading to her Jeep crossing into the median. The whole experience stuck with us, not just because of what we saw but because so many others going to the show, including some of the band members, got stuck in the backed up traffic for hours, delaying the show until late that night. When I was in kindergarten, I used to wait at a city bus stop every morning. Right next to it stood the biggest, oldest tree I'd ever seen. Its trunk was easily 6 feet across. The bus stop was near a busy 5-way intersection. One morning, I was standing there waiting when I suddenly heard tires screeching. A gray, beat-up little car, something like a Geo Metro, came speeding down a side street, ran the red light, and crashed into an SUV, which then spun into a UPS truck. The SUV lost control, spinning straight toward me and finally crashed into the big tree, just a foot or two away, showering me in bits of glass. The guy in the Metro looked shocked, then floored it and sped away. The SUV's radiator started steaming, but since I was a little kid who'd watched way too many action movies, I thought it was about to explode. I screamed at the driver to get out, but he seemed totally dazed. A bystander ran up, opened the door, and helped him out. Luckily, no one was seriously hurt. Later, we found out the Metro had been a stolen car from Idaho. But that wreck was the most surreal thing I've ever seen. The SUV spun around at least 8 times, almost like something out of Mario Kart, before hitting the tree. When I was 16, I was in gym class and had just walked out of the weight room when I saw 2 guys joking around, playfully fighting over some kind of stick. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something fly into the air, and both guys suddenly stopped, looking terrified. There was blood on the ground, and one of them was clutching his arm. The other guy started yelling and ran to get the gym teacher, while the injured guy just stood there, still holding his arm. The gym teacher quickly tried to help him to the nurse's office, but after seeing a trail of blood within about 20 feet, he called 911. The injured student was taken to the hospital. It turned out that the stick they were fighting over was actually a metal broom that snapped into 2 sharp pieces, one of which accidentally cut an artery in his arm. He was lucky, he spent a day in the hospital, but the doctors said if it had been a more major artery, things could have been much worse. Fortunately, the hospital was right next to the school, so he was able to get medical help quickly. The next day, a few of us were questioned by the principal about what had happened. Had it not been a friendly tussle, it might have been treated much more seriously. After I graduated high school, I moved to a nearby city about an hour and a half away for college and a good job opportunity. I often drove back home to visit my parents and friends. The road that connected us was a typical Florida highway, passing through a few small towns with scattered businesses along the way. One day, on my way back, I noticed a car heading in the opposite direction suddenly veer off the road, kicking up a huge cloud of dust as it swerved onto the shoulder. Through the dust, I saw a tire flying off the car. It started rolling across the lanes at a good speed. Cars around it were slowing down to avoid it, and somehow, the tire managed to cross all lanes of traffic, including mine, without hitting a single vehicle. Curious, I kept an eye on the tire in my rearview mirror to see where it would end up. Incredibly, the tire rolled off the road and right into the work bay of one of those little businesses along the highway. And that business? It was a tire shop. It was a couple of days before Christmas, and I was sitting in the back seat of my parents' car as we drove down the freeway. We happened to be on a stretch of bridge that crossed over another freeway below. Suddenly, we noticed the car in front of us swerve to avoid something. At the last second, we saw there was a Christmas tree lying in the middle of our lane, and my dad had to swerve sharply to avoid it. I turned around to see what happened with the cars behind us. Right behind us was a large 15-passenger van that didn't react quickly enough and ran over the tree, causing the driver to lose control. The van skidded quickly toward the side of the road, away from the median, and collided hard with the guardrail, likely from the driver overcorrecting. It was moving so fast that I thought it might flip over the rail and fall to the freeway below, but, thankfully, it didn't. What I did see was that a window shattered on the passenger side, and something flew out, looking almost like a package. By then, we were already moving farther away from the scene, and I remember thinking that the van was lucky, it could have been a lot worse. That evening, I saw a news report about the incident, which surprised me, as I hadn't thought anyone had been seriously hurt. Unfortunately, it turned out that the package I saw was an infant who hadn't been in a car seat, held in the arms of one of the parents in the van. The child was ejected from the vehicle during the impact, and sadly, didn't survive. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Austria, 2005. We had just finished a morning of snowboarding and were having lunch when we saw an emergency sled carrying an injured woman down the piste. The medics brought her near us to wait for helicopter transport. Alpine rescue teams seemed to love using helicopters, and it always felt a bit over the top to me. I remembered the time a snowboard sliced through my leg, and I insisted on being taken down by snowmobile rather than flown out to a hospital in Tyrol, far from where I was staying. The helicopter landed near our tables, and we watched as the woman was carefully loaded in while we enjoyed our French fries. But as the helicopter began to take off, it tipped forward a little too quickly and ended up catching on the telephone wires leading to our restaurant. In an instant, the helicopter flipped upside down with a loud bang that echoed across the entire valley, crashing onto the hill below us. The woman's husband tried to run down to the wreck, but the medics held him back. We were told to stay where we were, but one of my friends rushed down anyway and started throwing snow on the engine to keep it from overheating. Brave or reckless, we weren't sure. Sadly, 2 people survived, but the woman didn't make it, and her husband was in shock. The crash shut down all the lifts in the area for the day, leaving people in the farther regions to hike back over the mountains to reach the valley. Back in the early 90s, I worked as a teller at a bank on the south side of Atlanta. One day, a guy came in looking a bit rough. He wore shabby clothes, almost like he was homeless, and carried an old .22 pistol. The teller he approached handed over everything in the drawer, minus the die pack that would mark the cash. A week later, the same guy walked into the bank again, but this time he was wearing a brand new tracksuit and carrying a shiny, nickel-plated .38. Apparently, he had used the money from the first robbery to upgrade his clothes and his weapon. Again, the teller gave him everything in the drawer, die pack excluded. The local police were particularly irritated that he robbed the same bank twice within a week, so they decided to stake out our branch for a whole year. They told us that if the guy ever came back, we should hit the floor and let them handle it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, he never came back. I was a medical student working at a hospital, and we had a patient who had vomited blood, hematemesis, at home but was stable upon admission. While resting in his hospital bed, he had another episode, so we rushed him to the surgical suite for an endoscopy. We found a mildly bleeding ulcer that was slowing down, so we tried to coagulate it, but it wasn't holding well. The gastroenterologist felt surgery was needed, but the surgeon suggested attempting to fully seal the ulcer first. So, the GI doc tried again, but as soon as he touched the clot, blood began streaming out. We rushed him to the operating room, where the surgeons prepped to address the ulcer directly. There was a drape over the patient's head while the surgeons worked on the abdomen, and the anesthesia team was busy setting up blood products and fluids. I'd been observing from the head of the bed when one of the surgeons asked me, "How's he looking up top?" I lifted the drape, and saw blood pouring from his mouth and nose, something I never thought I'd see outside of a movie, but this was all too real. The ulcer had eroded into a major artery. Fortunately, the surgical team was able to control it, and he recovered after receiving close to 18 units of blood in just a few hours. It's an image I'll never forget, and hopefully, it will be the most intense experience I ever witnessed firsthand. Driving through central Spain, we saw a minivan coming toward us on the highway, swerving violently. Suddenly, it veered down into the ditch between the two sides of the road, only to come back up and launch into the air, flying diagonally over our car. It spun through the air, almost like it was corkscrewing, and then smashed into the ground behind us as we drove under it. I was staring in shock, my mind going blank as I tried to register what was happening. I saw the van roll 2 or 3 times in my rearview mirror before it hit me just how serious this was. I slammed on the brakes, and we both jumped out. My girlfriend got out barefoot, but quickly realized the road was covered in broken glass. I ran back to the car for the first aid kit. Several people, including me, gathered at the shoulder of the raised highway, watching the minivan as it lay on its back, smoking. A brave passerby ran down to check on the driver. Just as he reached the van, the driver's door fell open, and everyone started yelling, "Get out! It could go up!" As the driver fell out like a sack of potatoes, and got up on his feet like a boss, wiping the torrent of blood from a slight scalp wound off his forehead. Amazingly, he survived with just a small scalp wound. He said he'd blacked out briefly, causing him to lose control. But the image of that minivan spinning over our car like something out of an action movie? I'll never forget it. On a big road trip, I was looking for a campground when my buddy's car broke down on the highway between San Diego and Tijuana around 9 or 10 p.m. We had no idea what to do. Luckily, before long, a guy walked up the road, on his way home from a store, and offered to help us out. He checked under the hood and said the clutch cable had broken, then asked if we had any wire, which we didn't. So he looked around, spotted some barbed wire on a nearby fence, and tore off a length. He got under the hood and tied one end of the wire where the clutch cable should attach. He found a bottle opener in the car, attached the other end to it, and said he'd ride on the hood, pull on the bottle opener end, and tell me when to shift. So we got it into first gear and started moving, with him riding on the hood and calling out, "Okay, second." And I shifted, amazed that it was actually working. He did the same into third and then into fourth, and soon we were going about 40 miles an hour down the road, him clutching a bottle opener and wire on the hood. Somehow, we made it to his place just fine, set up our tent, and spent the evening hanging out with him and his brother, drinking, playing guitar, and occasionally spotting people crossing the border. Every so often, a border patrol helicopter would pass by with its spotlight. The next day, our new friend fixed the car for just $12, so we took him down to Tijuana and bought him drinks all night to thank him. One of my most memorable experiences happened at Pike Place Market in Seattle. Our family loved going there to eat the amazing food and enjoy the sights. A favorite spot was always the fish market, where the staff are known for tossing fish across the counter and interacting with customers. As we were watching the action, we saw a pickpocket grab someone's wallet and take off, heading straight for the fish market. As people started yelling, one of the fishmongers took action. No kidding, he threw a huge salmon, easily 15 or 20 pounds, right at the pickpocket and then tackled him. The crowd cheered, and when the police arrived, the fishmonger got a round of applause. It was awesome. Another memory, definitely on the stranger side, happened when we lived in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. We were on a family shopping trip to Costco, and about 20 minutes in, a guy started shouting, loudly. He was a tall man, probably around 6 feet 5 inches and 210 pounds, and he was dressed in bright, mismatched clothing with a blonde wig and makeup. My parents told us to earmuff it, so I don't remember everything he said, but I do recall him shouting things like, "I'm just trying to shop here. Wanna go? Let's go." After a bit, an elderly woman who was with him stepped in and tried to calm him down. As a 9-year-old, it was one of the oddest things I'd ever seen. I used to work at a hotel in Beverly Hills where celebrities would often stay. One day, a woman came in with 3 younger girls and politely asked where a certain member of the Backstreet Boys was staying. I pretended to check our records and told her that we didn't have anyone by that name staying with us. She immediately lost it, yelled something to the girls, and they all ran toward the elevator. For the next half hour, the 4 of them were loudly knocking on doors, crying one moment, then singing the next as they searched for him. Eventually, the police showed up. The mother began yelling at them, claiming they were supposed to be here and accusing me of refusing to give her information. I explained to the officers that none of the band members were actually staying with us, only their stage crew. Upon hearing this, she started crying, and in a moment of distress, even had an unfortunate accident on the floor. The officers then escorted her out. Just another day on the job.